We came up out of the swamp to the high ground there at Angerville, where the church was, and so by the time the sun came up, there was maybe 150 of us in that vicinity, and there were God knows how many Germans, but there was a lot of rifle fire, a lot of firing going on. We had 2 doctors in each battalion, and there's a medical section, 3 medical aid men in each rifle company, and the way they scattered us on the drop, neither of our doctors showed up, so Bob Wright and I were the only 2 medics that assembled in this area around the church at Angoville. So we started rounding up the drop casualties and gunfire and shrapnel casualties, and putting them in the church. And the ones that weren't mobile, we laid them out in the pews, and we had some old parachute silk. We covered them up with parachute silk, and there's still some blood stains in the pews there at Angoville. Yeah, we didn't realize that there were a couple of Krauts up in the attic there in the steeple, and they stayed up there. Didn't come down till the next day. And they were just a couple of kids. They were scared. Bob and I started rounding up casualties, and we used a farm cart to transport the wounded that couldn't walk. And we had one of the first casualties that I took care of was a man named Luce, and he had gotten a whole burst of machine gun fire in his right arm. It was just shredded, and by the time I got up to help him, he had pretty well bled out. There was a large pool of blood in the ditch beside him. I put a tourniquet on and gave him a shot of morphine. And there was a lot of firing going on. Machine gun had just nailed him. So I had a piece of parachute silk, and I put him on that parachute silk and dragged him down the road to where I could get him into the cart, and I took him back to the church. He died that afternoon. We couldn't stop the bleeding. Another man was wounded. A bullet went through his helmet and grazed his scalp and knocked a chunk of bone out. And there's an artery that supplies blood to the head, and every time his heart pumped, a squirt of blood came out. And we tried, but we couldn't get it. The bleeding stopped, and he bled to death. We lost 2 of them that afternoon. They brought us a little girl that was wounded, and we put her in the church and bandaged her up and gave her a shot of morphine. But the civilians weren't around. We didn't see any of them.
There was when did the first wounded German arrive in the church, and was it a German officer who asked you? How did that work?
We tried to, the ones that were pretty badly wounded, we got into the pews, and the rest of them were sitting in the pews and up on the altar. It's not a very big church. Late in the afternoon, I was puttering around in the church, and I took my helmet off, And I was standing in the middle of the church, and all of a sudden there's a big crash, and a mortar shell hit the roof of the church, and a big chunk of plaster came down and banged me in the scalp and split my scalp open. Wasn't really a serious wound, but it bled quite a bit. They told us that there was a casualty about 100 yards away from the church that had a serious leg wound. And so Bob and I both went out to get him. And we stood him up and put an arm around each of our shoulders. And we walked him back to the church, and there's a courtyard, or not a courtyard, but an area out in front of the church, a big, wide area that we had to cross. And the Germans were on our left, and the Americans were over on our right, and they were firing back and forth across this area. So I told Bob, I said, get your armband out where they can see it. And we walked out, and everybody stopped firing, and we staggered across the plaza there and into the church, and then the firing picked up again. The Germans were pretty good about not shooting at medics. There were several times they could have shot me, but they didn't. And we didn't shoot at the German medics, so it was sort of agreement. Young men much like us, except they were wearing a different uniform. Civilians say that soldiers don't want to talk about their experiences, and that's really not true. We just don't know how to express it. There's no substitute for hearing a bullet snap past your head and you realize that someone's trying to kill you. And you can't explain or put into words how that feels. But it forever changes you. You're never quite the same. D-Day is a given. You say D-Day to someone, they know what you're talking about. And I was there, and I got a front row seat, and it was pretty unique.